The sensors flickered. Commander Data turned from his console, his pale features betraying no concern, but his posture carrying an edge of precision that drew immediate attention. The bridge of the USS Enterprise D hummed with its usual efficiency, but something in the android's stillness made the routine feel suddenly fragile. "Captain?" Data said, his voice carrying across the quiet deck. "I am detecting intermittent graviton flux in Sector 47 Alpha. The pattern is inconsistent with natural stellar phenomena." Captain Jean-Luc Picard rose from his chair, his movement deliberate and controlled. Every line of his Starfleet uniform remained crisp, every gesture measured. He crossed to Data's station with the bearing of a man who had made too many life-or-death decisions to waste motion on unnecessary ones. "Elaborate, Mr. Data." Data's fingers moved across his console with inhuman speed, pulling up readings that made no sense even to his positronic brain. The graviton fluctuations are accompanied by neutrino emissions that suggest subspace distortion. However, the emission pattern does not match any known megastructure or transwarp conduit in our database. Picard studied the display, his expression grave. In his years commanding the Enterprise, he had learned to recognize the shape of trouble before it fully materialized. This had that shape. Could it be a cloaked vessel? Unlikely, sir. The signature is too diffuse. It reads more like an echo than an active source. Data paused, tilting his head in that peculiar way he had when processing unexpected data. "If I may hypothesize, Captain, this resembles the residual effects of a temporal event." The word hung in the air like a dropped phaser. Before Picard could respond, the turbolift doors hissed open. A woman stepped onto the bridge, her Starfleet uniform noticeably less adorned than the officers around her. Darker colors, minimal insignia, the kind of deliberate plainness that suggested someone who preferred to work in the margins of attention. Her face carried the watchful neutrality of someone accustomed to witnessing disasters born from single wrong decisions. "Captain Picard," she said, her tone professional, but weighted with authority that had nothing to do with rank. "I'm Agent Keller, Department of Temporal Investigations. Starfleet Command assigned me to your vessel 40 minutes ago when the first anomaly readings reached subspace relay stations." Picard's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of his displeasure. The DTI had a habit of appearing uninvited and staying longer than welcome. "Agent Keller, I trust Starfleet Command briefed you on our standing protocols regarding temporal phenomena." They did. Keller moved to the railing overlooking the tactical station, her gaze fixed on the view screen where the distortion registered as a faint shimmer against the stars. "Which is why I'm here to ensure those protocols are followed. The Temporal Prime Directive exists for a reason, Captain. One misstep near an active temporal event can cascade into consequences we can't predict or contain. I am well aware of the directive, Agent. I'm sure you are." Her voice softened slightly, though her posture remained alert. But awareness and compliance aren't always the same thing when lives are at stake. Data interrupted before the tension could escalate. "Captain, I am now detecting a transwarp signature entering the sector." "Borg." The bridge went silent. Picard felt the old cold weight settle in his chest. The weight of memories he had fought for years to keep compartmentalized. The Borg. Of all the threats in the galaxy, none struck closer to the ragged edge of his control than the collective that had once made him its puppet. "Battle stations," he said quietly. The lighting shifted to crimson. Officers moved to their posts with practiced urgency. On the view screen, space rippled and tore as a massive cube-shaped vessel materialized from its transwarp conduit, its surface a nightmarish geometry of metal and malice. They are headed directly for the source of the graviton flux, Data reported. Their trajectory suggests they have been tracking the anomaly through subspace for some time. Keller stepped forward, her earlier detachment replaced by something sharper. Captain, if the Borg reach whatever is causing that temporal distortion? I understand the stakes, Agent. But before Picard could issue orders, a new sound cut through the bridge's tension, a groaning, wheezing noise that seemed to fold in on itself utterly wrong and utterly impossible. Every head turned toward the source. In the space between two consoles, the air began to twist. A shape materialized, tall blue, absurdly out of place. It looked like a police box from Earth's 20th century, complete with faded paint and a glowing light on top. The noise stopped. The box simply stood there, as if it had every right to exist on the bridge of a Starfleet vessel. The door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, lean, moving with the kind of controlled chaos that suggested he was perpetually one step ahead of everyone around him. His long coat swept behind him, old-fashioned and entirely inappropriate for the setting. His face was sharp, intelligent eyes, bright with the kind of restless curiosity that made dangerous situations feel like puzzles waiting to be solved. He looked around the bridge, took in the red alert, lighting the Borg cube on the view screen, and the various expressions of shock aimed in his direction. Then he smiled, not with amusement, but with the weary recognition of someone who had seen this particular flavor of catastrophe before. Right, he said, his accent crisp and British, his tone carrying the weight of someone used to being the only person in the room who understood the full scope of the problem. Which one of you was about to make a very bad decision regarding that temporal anomaly? Picard stared at the impossible man who had just materialized on his bridge. Agent Keller's hand moved instinctively toward her communicator. Data's head tilted in that curious way, processing something that defied his understanding of physical laws. The stranger's smile faded, replaced by something colder, sharper. Because whoever's knocking on the Guardian of Forever's door, he continued glancing at the Borg cube filling the view screen, just invited the universe's worst house guests to a party that could unwrite history itself. He turned back to Picard, and in that moment, the captain saw something in those ancient eyes. Not madness, not recklessness, but the terrible certainty of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall, who had carried the weight of impossible choices until they became routine. I'm the doctor, the man said simply. And unless you want the Borg to steal every moment you've ever lived, I suggest we skip the introductions and start talking about what happens when a time-traveling hive mind gets its hands on a sentient time portal. The red alert continued to pulse. The Borg cube advanced, and somewhere on a dead world in an unnamed sector, something ancient and patient waited for the first question it had heard in millennia. Picard had commanded the Enterprise through first contact scenarios that violated every expectation of rational physics. He had negotiated with entities that existed outside conventional space-time. He had, against his will, been made part of the Borg collective itself. None of that prepared him for a man stepping out of a blue box and claiming to know the future. Security, Picard said, his voice level but carrying absolute authority. The doctor raised both hands in a gesture of peace, though his expression suggested he found the precaution more tedious than threatening. Not necessary, Captain. I'm not armed, I'm not dangerous. Well, not to you, and I'm definitely not staying long enough to file paperwork. Agent Keller moved closer, her hand near her phaser, but not quite touching it. Captain, unauthorized temporal displacement onto a Starfleet vessel is a violation of about 17 regulations. Yes, I know. The doctor's tone carried the patience of someone who had heard similar speeches across multiple galaxies. But I didn't come here to debate jurisdiction. I came because someone is about to do something catastrophically stupid with the Guardian of Forever, and I happen to be the only person in this sector who knows exactly how badly that can end. Data spoke from his station, his curiosity apparently outweighing any concern about the stranger's impossible arrival. The Guardian of Forever. You refer to the temporal portal discovered on Gateway by the USS Enterprise under Captain Kirk in Stardate 3134.0. However, that location has been classified and quarantined by Starfleet for over a century. Classified, yes. Quarantined, technically. The doctor moved toward the view screen, studying the Borg cube with an expression that suggested he was calculating variables no one else in the room could perceive. But the Guardian doesn't care about your classifications. It exists at the intersection of every timeline, every possibility. And right now, something has disturbed it enough to create ripples in subspace that your sensors can detect halfway across the sector. Picard stepped between the doctor and the view screen, forcing the stranger to meet his gaze. You claim to know what we're facing. Prove it. The doctor's eyes, older than his face, suggested, carrying a weight that Picard recognized from mirrors on his worst days held steady. The graviton flux your commander detected isn't random. It's the Guardian responding to a subspace distortion, probably from old transwarp conduits or collapsing wormholes in this region. The Guardian has minimal active output most of the time, but when something rattles the structure of local space-time, it resonates. Think of it as a bell that only rings when reality gets hit hard enough. And the Borg. Picard kept his voice neutral, but his hands had unconsciously clenched behind his back. They followed the signal because they're very good at detecting things that shouldn't exist. They don't know what the Guardian is yet, but they know it's connected to time, and they know that mastery over time would make them unstoppable. The doctor's expression darkened. They're already perfect at assimilation. Give them the ability to assimilate history itself, and you won't just lose this battle. You'll lose every battle you've ever won. Keller's voice cut through the moment, sharp with professional skepticism. That's speculation. We don't know the Borg's intentions. I know the Borg. Picard spoke quietly, but every word carried the weight of trauma he had never fully escaped. If they have detected something of temporal significance, they will not stop until they have assimilated it or been destroyed. The doctor nodded slowly, a gesture of respect between two people who had both survived encounters that should have broken them. Then we're in agreement about the threat. Now we just need to agree on the solution. The solution, Keller said firmly, is to maintain the temporal prime directive. We observe, we document, and we do not interfere with temporal phenomena. The Guardian has existed for millennia without our intervention. It can survive the Borg's interest. The doctor turned to her with an expression of profound disbelief. Survive the Guardian isn't a museum piece you can protect with a force field and good intentions. It's a living doorway into every moment that has ever existed or ever will exist. The Borg don't want to study it, they want to weaponize it. And your temporal prime directive won't mean much when they use it to go back and assimilate Earth before your Federation ever formed. Data's console emitted a soft chime. Captain, the Borg cube has altered course. They are now heading directly toward the planet-designated Gateway. At current speed, they will achieve orbit in 47 minutes. Picard made his decision with the same cold clarity that had seen him through Wolf 3 and 59. Mr. Data, plot an intercept course, maximum warp. Aye, Captain. The Enterprise lurched into motion, stars stretching into lines as the warp drive engaged. Picard turned back to the doctor, who had settled against a console as if he had every right to be there. You will accompany us to the observation lounge. You will explain exactly what the Guardian of Forever is, what the Borg could do with it, and why I should trust a man who materializes on my bridge in a box that violates every law of physics I understand. The doctor smiled, thin-tired, but genuine. Fair enough. Though you should know, Captain, that box has saved more lives than your entire fleet combined. And I don't say that to boast. I say it so you'll understand that when I tell you the stakes, I'm not exaggerating. The observation lounge felt too small for the weight of what was being discussed. Picard sat at the head of the table, flanked by Data and his first officer, Commander Riker, who had joined them with the wary expression of someone expecting the situation to deteriorate further. Agent Keller stood rather than sat, her posture radiating institutional distrust. The doctor had claimed a chair near the viewport, where the stars blurred past in the peculiar luminescence of warp travel. The Guardian of Forever. The doctor began, his tone shifting into something that resembled a university lecturer explaining a concept his students were unlikely to believe. Is not a piece of technology. It's a sentient entity, ancient, patient, and entirely outside your understanding of linear time. It doesn't operate on chronometers or causality engines. It simply is, and it exists at every point in time simultaneously. Data leaned forward slightly. A simultaneous temporal omnipresence would require an energy signature inconsistent with our readings from Gateway. The Guardian has always registered as inert when not actively engaged. Because it only responds when asked, the doctor replied. It's not broadcasting itself across time, it's waiting. It has been described as awaiting a question, and that description is more accurate than your Starfleet reports probably credited. The Guardian doesn't judge, doesn't interfere, doesn't choose sides. It shows you what you asked to see, and it lets you step through if you're determined enough. But it won't help you, and it won't stop you from destroying yourself. Riker frowned, his skepticism evident. So it's neutral. Why would the Borg pose a threat to something that doesn't take sides? Because the Borg don't want it to take sides. They want to control it. The doctor's voice hardened. Imagine a hive mind with the ability to access any point in history. They could assimilate civilizations before they developed warp capability. They could study every defensive strategy ever used against them and adapt before the battle even began. They could remove their enemies from existence by simply assimilating their ancestors. Keller's expression had gone pale. That would create catastrophic temporal paradoxes. The timeline would collapse. Would it? The doctor met her gaze with something that looked disturbingly like pity. The Guardian has witnessed every paradox that ever was. It exists because it's durable enough to survive contradictions that would shred normal space-time. The Borg wouldn't break it. They'd just use it to rewrite everything you know as absolute fact into something that serves the collective. Picard's hands were clasped in front of him, the only outward sign of the tension coiling in his chest. You speak as if you've encountered the Guardian before. Not this one specifically, but I've seen enough temporal focal points to know when someone is playing with fire they don't understand. The doctor's gaze drifted to the viewport, though Picard suspected he was looking at something far beyond the stars. The difference is, most people who find power like that have the wisdom to be afraid of it. The Borg don't feel fear. They'll walk straight into a force that could unmake them confident that assimilation will solve every problem. Data tilted his head in that characteristic gesture of processing. If the Guardian is as formidable as you suggest, would it not refuse the Borg access? You stated it responds to questions. Surely it would recognize the danger of their intent. The Guardian doesn't make moral judgments. It doesn't evaluate intent. The doctor's voice carried a frustration that suggested he had argued this point before in other contexts with other civilizations. If the Borg ask to see a specific point in time, the Guardian will show them. If they step through, it will let them. It's not a gatekeeper. It's a mirror that reflects what you seek, and a door that opens if you're willing to cross the threshold. Silence settled over the observation lounge. Picard broke it with the question that mattered most. Can it be stopped? Can the Borg be prevented from accessing it? Prevented, maybe. Destroyed, no. The doctor straightened in his chair, and for a moment Picard saw the full weight of whatever impossible burden this man carried. The Guardian is older than your Federation, older than the Borg, possibly older than this galaxy. You don't destroy something like that. You just try very, very hard not to let it become a weapon. Keller stepped forward, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. Captain Picard, under the Temporal Prime Directive, I am obligated to advise that any direct action near the Guardian constitutes a severe risk of timeline contamination. We should be calling for reinforcements and establishing a quarantine zone, not charging in to engage the Borg. Reinforcements will arrive too late, Picard said flatly. And a quarantine zone will not stop a Borg cube already in transit. Then we observe Keller insisted. We document what happens and trust that the Guardian's own nature will protect it from exploitation. The doctor laughed a short, bitter sound, utterly devoid of humor. Trust. You want to trust that a sentient time portal will protect itself from a species that turns entire civilizations into extensions of their own will. He stood moving to the viewport, as if he couldn't bear to look at Keller's face while speaking. I've watched worlds burn because people trusted that the universe would sort itself out. It doesn't. The universe doesn't care. It just keeps moving, and if you're unlucky enough to be standing in the wrong place, when catastrophe arrives, all the regulations and protocols in your database won't save you. Picard recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone who had made terrible choices and lived with the consequences. Mr. Data, Picard said quietly, how long until we reach Gateway? 31 minutes, Captain. 31 minutes to decide whether to follow protocol or prevent a catastrophe. 31 minutes to determine if the man standing at the viewport was a savior or a threat. Picard looked at the doctor's silhouette against the stars and made a choice that would have horrified Starfleet Command. Doctor, you will work with Commander Data to develop a strategy for preventing Borg access to the Guardian without violating the temporal integrity of the site. Agent Keller, you will monitor all actions taken and prepare a full report for the DTI. If we fail, they will need to know exactly what went wrong. Keller's jaw tightened, but she nodded. The doctor turned from the viewport, and something in his expression had shifted gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. Thank you, Captain. Don't thank me yet, Picard replied. If this goes wrong, we'll all have eternity to regret it. The Enterprise hurtled through the void, toward a dead world, a temporal anomaly, and a Borg cube that wanted to devour history itself. And somewhere ahead, patient as stone and older than memory, the Guardian of Forever waited for the first question it would answer in a very long time. Gateway hung in the view screen like a tombstone in space, a dead world, atmosphere long since stripped away, surface scarred by geological violence that had ended eons before humanity learned to make fire. The Borg cube was already there, a geometric nightmare in orbit, its surface crawling with the mechanical precision of a hive preparing for work. They beat us, Riker said quietly from his position at Picard's side. Not by much. The doctor had moved to stand near the tactical station hands, in his coat pockets, studying the cube with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every detail. 5 minutes, maybe 6. They're still scanning the surface. They haven't committed to a landing party yet. Data's fingers moved across his console with practiced efficiency. Confirmed, Doctor. The Borg vessel is conducting intensive subspace scans of the planet's northern continent. That region corresponds to the location of the Guardian of Forever in Starfleet records. Picard felt the familiar weight settle into his shoulders, the burden of command, when all options carried unacceptable costs. Options, Mr. Worf. The Klingon security chief's response was immediate and grim. We cannot defeat a Borg cube with a single vessel captain. Our weapons would be adapted to within minutes. Even if we disabled their transwarp capability, they would still reach the surface. Then we don't try to destroy them. The doctor turned from the view screen, and his expression carried the kind of dangerous creativity that Picard had learned to recognize in officers who were about to propose something brilliant and terrible. We delay them. Make it difficult enough to reach the Guardian that they recalculate whether the prize is worth the effort. Agent Keller, who had been silent since they entered orbit, finally spoke. Any action that interferes with their approach constitutes a temporal intervention. The moment we fire on that cube near a temporal anomaly, we risk creating causality fractures. We're already in the temporal anomaly's sphere of influence. The doctor shot back, his patience visibly fraying. Every second we spend debating protocol is a second closer to the Borg connecting to that portal. I'd rather risk a causality fracture than guarantee a temporal catastrophe. Picard raised a hand, silencing the argument before it could escalate. Commander LaForge, could we modify the deflector array to emit a subspace disruption field, something that would interfere with the Borg's scanning capability, without constituting a direct attack? From engineering. Geordi LaForge's voice came through the comm with the cautious optimism of someone presented with an interesting technical challenge. It's possible, Captain. We could cycle the deflector to produce graviton pulses on a rotating frequency. It wouldn't stop them from scanning, but it would slow them down, make the data harder to process. Like trying to read through a strobe light. How long to implement? Give me 8 minutes. The doctor nodded approvingly. That's the thinking. You're not attacking them. You're just making the neighborhood unpleasant. The Borg adapt, but adaptation takes time, and time is the one thing we can steal from them. Data tilted his head in that characteristic gesture of processing unexpected variables. However, Dr. the Borg's adaptive capability is formidable. Any disruption we generate will eventually be compensated for. Historical records indicate successful adaptation timeframes ranging from 47 seconds to 4.3 minutes, depending on the complexity of the countermeasure. Then we'll need more than one trick. The doctor began pacing his movements, sharp and restless. What else can you do with that deflector? What other frequencies can you throw at them? Picard watched the doctor move, recognizing the pattern of a mind working through possibilities at a speed that left verbal explanations struggling to catch up. It was uncomfortably familiar. He had seen it in his own reflection during the worst moments of tactical crisis. Mr. Data scanned the area between our position and the Borg cube. Are there any spatial anomalies we could exploit? Subspace eddies, gravitational fluctuations, anything that might provide additional interference? Data's fingers flew across his console. There is a region of elevated subspace turbulence approximately 40,000 kilometers from the Borg vessel. It appears to be a residual effect from their transwarp corridor exit. If we positioned ourselves near that turbulence and synchronized our deflector emissions with the existing distortion, we could amplify the interference effect significantly. The doctor stopped pacing, a grin flashing across his face, the first genuine expression of pleasure Picard had seen from him. Now that's clever. Use their own wake against them. I like it. Make it so, Mr. Data. The Enterprise shifted position, maneuvering with the grace of a vessel designed for both exploration and battle. On the view screen, the Borg cube remained motionless, its scanning beams invisible but detectable by the sensors as they swept methodically across Gateway's surface. Captain, Worf reported, his tone carrying an edge of concern. The Borg have detected our course change. They are rotating to maintain observation of our vessel. Let them watch, Picard said calmly. We're not attacking. We're simply taking up a strategic position. Keller moved closer to Picard's chair, her voice low but urgent. Captain, you're threading an extraordinarily narrow line here. The DTI will demand a full accounting of every action taken within range of a temporal phenomenon. If this escalates, Agent Keller, I will accept full responsibility. Picard didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the cube that had taken so much from him once before. But I will not stand by while the Borg gain access to a weapon that could unmake the timeline itself. The doctor had returned to the viewport, his reflection visible against the star field and the curve of Gateway below. You know what the worst part is? The Borg probably don't even understand what they're reaching for. They just know it's powerful, and their programming says powerful things should be assimilated. They're like children playing with matches in a munitions depot, too focused on the flame to notice the explosion waiting to happen. An apt metaphor, Data observed, though it raises the question of whether the Borg's lack of understanding makes them more or less dangerous in this context. More, the doctor and Picard said simultaneously. Their eyes met, and in that moment Picard saw the recognition pass between them two men who had both learned that ignorance armed with power was the most lethal combination in the universe. Deflector modifications complete, Captain, LaForge reported. Ready to engage on your order. Picard leaned forward slightly, every muscle in his body aware of the weight of what came next. Engage. The Enterprise's deflector array pulsed with invisible energy, sending cascading waves of graviton interference through the subspace turbulence. On the view screen, nothing changed visibly, but the sensor readings told the story. The Borg cube's scanning beams began to fluctuate their precision, degrading as they fought through the interference. It's working, Data confirmed. The Borg's scanning efficiency has decreased by 37%. They are compensating, but the adaptation is proceeding more slowly than projected, likely due to the irregular nature of the interference pattern created by the subspace turbulence. Worf's voice carried grim satisfaction. The Borg are increasing power to their scanning arrays. They are also launching a probe toward the planet's surface. The doctor swore under his breath, a word in a language Picard didn't recognize, but whose meaning was entirely clear from context. They're getting impatient. That's either very good or very bad, depending on what they do next. The probe has entered Gateway's atmosphere, Data reported. It is descending toward the Guardian's location. Picard's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. The probe was a predictable response. If orbital scans were compromised, send something closer. But it also represented an escalation, a commitment of resources that suggested the Borg were no longer merely curious. Doctor, Picard said quietly, if that probe reaches the Guardian, what happens? The doctor's expression had gone cold, his earlier energy replaced by something harder. Depends on what it asks. The Guardian responds to questions, remember. If the probe is sophisticated enough to formulate an inquiry, even a simple one, the Guardian might show it something. And if the collective sees what the Guardian can do through the probe's sensors, they'll commit everything to securing it. Can we destroy the probe? You could, the doctor said slowly, turning to face Picard with an expression that suggested he was weighing options he disliked equally. But that's an act of aggression. Right now, you're just making their scans difficult. Destroy their probe, and you give them justification to classify you as a threat, requiring immediate neutralization. Keller stepped forward, her composure cracking slightly. Captain, we are rapidly approaching a point of no return. If you fire on Borg assets while in proximity to a temporal anomaly— I know the regulations, Agent. Picard's voice carried steel beneath the calm. But I also know the Borg. And I know that hesitation born from fear of protocol has killed more people than decisive action ever has. The doctor moved to stand beside Picard's chair, his voice quiet enough that only the captain could hear. She's not wrong, you know. We are at a crossroads. Whatever you decide in the next 30 seconds will determine whether we're fighting a delaying action or starting a war we can't win. What would you do? Picard asked, genuinely curious. The doctor's smile was thin and joyless. I'd cheat. Find a third option no one's thought of yet, because both obvious choices lead to disaster. He paused, then added, but I've also had a lot more practice at cheating than you have. Son. Picard almost laughed, a sharp exhale that might have been amusement in a less dire situation. Then help me cheat, Doctor. What's the option we're not seeing? The doctor's eyes went distant for a moment, that calculating look that suggested he was running through scenarios at a speed that left mere mortals behind. Then his focus snapped back sharp and certain. The probe is looking for the Guardian. But it doesn't know exactly where the Guardian is, yet your interference is slowing its scans. So instead of destroying the probe— The doctor's grin returned sharper and more dangerous than before. We help it. We feed it bad data. Data turned from his console, intrigued. You propose providing the Borg probe with false coordinates for the Guardian's location. Not just false coordinates. A very specific set of false coordinates that lead it somewhere structurally similar, but fundamentally useless. The doctor moved to Data's station, leaning over to examine the planetary scans. Gateway's surface is covered in ancient ruins, your records say as much. Find me something that looks enough like a temporal anomaly to fool a probe operating through heavy interference, and we'll send the Borg on a wild goose chase. Picard considered the proposal, weighing it against every regulation he had ever sworn to uphold. It was deceptive. It was risky. It bought time without committing to violence. It was exactly the kind of solution he would have proposed himself if he'd thought of it first. Mr. Data, can it be done? Data's fingers were already moving across his console. There is a geological formation approximately 140 kilometers from the Guardian's actual location. The mineral composition includes traces of chronoton particles, likely residue from ancient temporal experiments by the planet's former inhabitants. If we modulate our deflector emissions to highlight that formation while suppressing data from the Guardian's true location, the probe's sensors would register a strong false positive. Do it, Picard ordered. The Enterprise's deflector array shifted frequencies, its invisible manipulation of subspace becoming suddenly surgical in precision. On the sensor display, the false signal bloomed like a beacon, while the Guardian's actual signature faded into background noise. The probe has altered course, Worf reported. It is now descending toward the false coordinates. The doctor straightened his expression, caught between satisfaction and unease. That buys us time. Maybe 20 minutes before they realize they've been had. Maybe less if they're particularly clever today. Then we use those 20 minutes wisely, Picard said. Mr. Data, prepare an away team. We're going to the Guardian's location before the Borg realize their mistake." Keller's voice rose in alarm. "Captain, an away mission to the Guardian itself is a direct violation." "Agent Keller." Picard turned to face her fully, and his voice carried the authority of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed. "The Borg are committed. We cannot stop them from reaching the Guardian eventually. But we can ensure that when they arrive, they find us already there, ready to prevent them from accessing it. That is not a violation of temporal law. That is defense of a strategic asset." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the Enterprise's systems and the faint pulse of the deflector array maintaining its deception. Finally, Keller nodded, though her expression suggested she was already composing the report that would end Picard's career. "Understood, Captain. But I'm coming with you. If Starfleet is going to court-martial anyone over this, they should at least have an accurate witness." The doctor laughed a genuine sound this time, carrying surprised respect. "I like her, Captain. She's terrified and furious, and she's still walking into the fire because it's the right thing to do. That's the kind of person who survives conversations with the Guardian." Picard stood feeling the weight of command settle into certainty. "Mr. Riker, you have the bridge. If the Borg detect our deception and move against us, you are authorized to use any means necessary to protect the away team. Understood." "Understood, Captain." Riker's expression was grim but resolute. "Try not to break time while you're down there. We'll do our best, Number 1. As Picard headed for the turbolift, the doctor fell into step beside him, and Data followed with his characteristic perfect posture. Keller brought up the rear, her hand resting on her phaser, with the practiced ease of someone who expected to need it. "Doctor," Picard said as the turbolift doors closed, "when we reach the Guardian, what exactly should we expect?" The doctor's expression went distant, ancient, haunted by memories of things Picard couldn't begin to imagine. A door that opens onto infinity, a voice that echoes from the beginning of time, and a choice that will define whether we save history or become part of its worst mistake. The turbolift descended, carrying them toward the transporter room and the planet below. On the view screen, the Borg probe landed at the false coordinates and began scanning a ruin that would tell it nothing useful. The clock was ticking, and the Guardian of Forever waited patient as stone for the questions it knew were coming. The transporter beam released them onto a surface that had forgotten what life looked like. Gateway's northern continent stretched in all directions as a wasteland of cracked stone and dust so fine it hung in the thin atmosphere like a shroud. The ruins that dotted the landscape were beyond ancient, eroded by time, until they resembled natural formations more than architecture. The sky above was a washed-out gray, starless, despite the lack of atmosphere thick enough to obscure them. Picard's tricorder chirped softly, its readings confirming what his eyes already told him. This world had been dead for longer than human civilization had existed. This way, Data said, his android physiology unaffected by the hostile environment. He gestured toward a ridge of stone that rose like a broken spine from the planet's surface. "The Guardian is located approximately 0.8 kilometers in that direction." The doctor was already moving his long coat, whipping in the thin wind, his expression focused with an intensity that suggested he could feel something the others could not. "It's close. I can sense the temporal distortion from here, like standing near a waterfall and feeling the spray before you see the water." Agent Keller adjusted her environmental suit's seals, her movements precise despite the bulky equipment. "Captain, I'm registering elevated chronoton radiation in this area. Whatever the Guardian is, it's actively affecting local space-time." "Noted." Picard fell into step beside the doctor, his boots crunching against the dead ground. "Doctor, You've been vague about what we should expect when we encounter the Guardian. I need specifics. How do we prevent the Borg from accessing it without destroying it or contaminating the timeline? The doctor didn't slow his pace, but his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been avoiding this conversation deliberately. You can't prevent them from accessing it, Captain. Not in the traditional sense. The Guardian doesn't have locks or security protocols. It responds to intent and inquiry. If the Borg ask it to show them a specific moment in time, it will comply. Then how? We change what they're able to ask. The doctor stopped abruptly, turning to face Picard with eyes that seemed older in the gray light. The Guardian is sentient, but it's also literal. It shows you what you request, not what you want. The trick is making sure the Borg's request is imprecise enough to be useless. Data, who had been scanning ahead with his tricorder, interjected with characteristic logic. That approach assumes the Borg will formulate their inquiry carelessly. However, the collective's analytical capability is formidable. They are unlikely to phrase a temporal query without extensive preparation. Which is why we need to be there when they arrive, the doctor replied. Not to fight them, we'd lose, but to complicate their approach enough that they make a mistake. Keller's voice carried skepticism sharp enough to cut. You're proposing we rely on the Borg making an error. The same Borg who have assimilated thousands of species and adapted to every defensive strategy Starfleet has deployed against them. I'm proposing we make them think they've already won. The doctor resumed walking his pace, quickening as they approached the ridge. Confidence breeds carelessness, even in a hive mind. Especially in a hive mind because they've never encountered something they couldn't eventually assimilate. They crested the ridge, and the Guardian of Forever came into view. Picard had read the reports Kirk's encountered, the temporal investigations, the classified analyses that had been conducted over decades. None of it prepared him for the reality. The Guardian stood in a shallow valley, a massive arch of material that defied categorization. It looked like stone, but moved like liquid metal. Its surface rippling with patterns that might have been circuitry, or might have been the written language of a civilization so advanced that technology and art had become indistinguishable. The arch framed nothing, or perhaps it framed everything, because the space within it seemed deeper than the valley behind it should allow, as if looking through a lens that bent more than light. The air around the Guardian shimmered with heat that had no source, and Picard's tricorder emitted a cascade of error messages as it tried and failed to classify what it was detecting. Guardian of Forever, the doctor said softly, and his voice carried something Picard had not heard from him before reverence. Still waiting after all this time. Data approached cautiously, his sensors recording everything, despite their obvious inability to make sense of the readings. Fascinating. The Guardian's material composition registers as quasi-metallic, but it exhibits properties inconsistent with any known element or alloy. Its energy signature is paradoxical. It appears to be emitting and absorbing chronoton particles simultaneously. Because it exists at every point in time at once, the doctor explained, moving closer to the arch with the careful respect one might show an ancient cathedral. Past, present, future, they're all the same to the Guardian. It's not traveling through time. It is time in a localized and sentient form. Picard activated his comm badge. Enterprise, this is Captain Picard. We have reached the Guardian's location. Status report. Riker's voice came through with static that suggested the temporal radiation was interfering with communications. Captain, the Borg probe has finished scanning the false coordinates. The cube is repositioning. Looks like they've realized we sent them to the wrong location. Estimate you have 12 minutes before they deploy a landing party to your position. 12 minutes to prepare for the impossible. Picard turned to his team, assessing the tactical situation with the instincts of a commander who had survived too many battles to waste time on optimism. Recommendations. We cannot defend this position against a Borg landing party, Data stated with android matter-of-factness. Even if we had the full complement of Enterprise security personnel, the Borg would adapt to our weapons within moments of engagement. Then we don't defend it, Picard said. We make it indefensible for them as well. The doctor nodded slowly, a grim smile crossing his face. Now you're thinking like someone who's run out of good options and has to make do with terrible ones. Keller stepped forward, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine alarm. Captain, whatever you're planning, remember that we are standing next to a temporal focal point. Any weapon discharge any energy emission strong enough to disrupt the Borg could also disrupt the Guardian's temporal stability. She's right, the doctor admitted. Which is why conventional tactics won't work. We need something the Borg haven't seen before, something they can't adapt to because it's not actually an attack. Picard studied the Guardian, his tactical mind turning over possibilities. The deflector array bought us time by creating interference. Could we do something similar here? Create a localized distortion that makes it difficult for the Borg to interface with the Guardian. Difficult, but not impossible. Data's fingers moved across his tricorder, running calculations that would have taken a human team hours. If we modulated the Enterprise's deflector to emit a rotating subspace pulse pattern, we could create a temporal static field around the Guardian. The Borg would still be able to approach physically, but their scanning and analysis capabilities would be severely degraded. The doctor was pacing now, his coat trailing through the dust, his mind clearly working through scenarios at a speed that left his body struggling to keep up. That's half the solution. But we need more than just static. We need a way to confuse their approach so thoroughly that even when they reach the Guardian, they don't know what question to ask. A paradox. Data said, his tone carrying the slight inflection that suggested he was intrigued by the concept, despite or perhaps because of its illogic. If we could introduce a localized temporal paradox into the immediate area, the Borg collective's shared consciousness would struggle to reconcile the contradictory information. Keller's voice rose sharply. Absolutely not. Creating a temporal paradox is precisely the kind of contamination the Temporal Prime Directive was designed to prevent. You're talking about deliberately damaging the timeline. I'm talking about a contained micro-paradox. The doctor corrected his tone, patient but firm. Something small enough to create interference without cascading into a full causality violation. Think of it as temporal white noise. It exists, briefly confuses anyone trying to analyze it, then collapses back into normal space-time without leaving a scar. That's theoretical at best, Keller shot back. There's no guarantee a paradox wouldn't expand beyond containment. You could unravel local causality completely. I've done it before, the doctor said quietly. Multiple times, in fact, though I'm not particularly proud of it. My ship, the TARDIS, can generate a very specific form of temporal disruption that exists in a closed loop. It creates a pocket of contradictory time that fades within minutes, leaving no lasting damage to the timeline. Picard listened to the argument with the growing certainty that they were running out of time to debate theory. Doctor, can you guarantee this micro-paradox would be contained and temporary? The doctor met his gaze with uncomfortable honesty. No. I can make it extremely likely, but there are no guarantees when you're manipulating fundamental forces of the universe. What I can tell you is that the risk of a contained paradox failing is significantly lower than the risk of the Borg successfully accessing the Guardian. "Captain," Riker's voice crackled through the comm badge. "Borg transporters are active. They're beaming down a landing party to your coordinates. Estimate arrival in 7 minutes. 7 minutes to decide whether to trust a man who traveled in a blue box and claimed to understand temporal mechanics better than Starfleet's entire scientific community. Picard looked at Keller, whose expression had gone pale beneath her environmental suit's visor. "Agent Keller, you represent the Department of Temporal Investigations. What is your assessment?" Keller was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the Guardian's rippling surface. When she spoke, her voice was thick with the weight of a decision that could end her career. "The Temporal Prime Directive exists to prevent catastrophic timeline contamination. If the Borg gain control of the Guardian, the contamination would be total, absolute. Everything the Federation has ever been or will be could cease to exist." She turned to face Picard, and her eyes held the look of someone stepping off a cliff. "I cannot officially sanction the creation of a temporal paradox. But I can acknowledge that in this specific circumstance, inaction carries a greater risk than action." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "That's as close to a blessing as we're going to get from someone who writes reports for a living. I'll take it." "What do you need from us?" Picard asked. "Time and coverage." The doctor was already moving toward the Guardian, his movements quick and purposeful. "I need to calibrate the TARDIS to generate a paradox bubble that's precisely tuned to local temporal conditions. That's going to take about 4 minutes of undisturbed concentration. Once it's active, the Borg will be able to reach us physically, but their sensors will give them contradictory readings about the Guardian's nature and function. They'll be able to see it, but they won't be able to understand it well enough to formulate a useful query." Data stepped forward. "I will assist with the calibration. My computational speed may accelerate the process." "Good." The doctor pulled a device from his coat pocket. Something that looked like a cross between a wand and a scientific instrument covered in incomprehensible markings. "Meanwhile, Captain Yu and Agent Keller need to make sure we're not interrupted before the paradox is stable. Can the Enterprise provide covering fire without violating too many regulations?" Picard activated his comm badge. "Mr. Worf, prepare to provide tactical support to the away team's position. Target any Borg drones that materialize within 50 meters of our coordinates, but do not engage the cube itself. We're buying time, not starting a war." "Understood, Captain." Worf's voice carried the satisfaction of a warrior finally given permission to act. "Phaser targeting solutions are locked." The doctor was already working his strange device, a sonic screwdriver, Data's tricorder, identified it as though that classification seemed woefully inadequate, emitting pulses of energy that made the air around the Guardian shimmer even more intensely. Data stood beside him. Tricorder extended feeding data in a rapid stream that the doctor absorbed and incorporated with barely a glance. 4 minutes. The doctor muttered more to himself than anyone else. 4 minutes to create a localized causality loop, anchor it to the Guardian's temporal signature, and pray that it collapses cleanly instead of expanding. Brilliant. I've had worse plans, but not by much. Picard drew his phaser, checking its charge with the practiced ease of a man who had carried weapons for longer than he cared to remember. Beside him, Keller did the same, her hands steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "Captain," she said quietly, "if we survive this, the DTI is going to demand a full investigation. There will be hearings, testimony, possibly criminal charges for temporal violations." "I know," Picard replied. "But if we don't survive this, the DTI won't exist to file charges." A grim smile crossed Keller's face. "Fair point." The air in front of them began to distort, not the shimmer of the Guardian's presence, but the sharp geometric distortion of Borg transporter technology. The first drones materialized 20 meters away, their cybernetic forms immediately scanning the area with the methodical precision of machines built for assimilation. Worf's targeting was perfect. Phaser beams lanced down from the Enterprise, in orbit, striking the drones with enough force to disable their motor functions without destroying them outright. The Borg collapsed their adaptive shields, already beginning to compensate for the specific frequency of the Enterprise's weapons. More drones materialized. 3 minutes. The doctor called out, his voice tight with concentration. Keep them off us for 3 more minutes. Picard fired his hand phaser, the beam catching a Borg drone center mass. It staggered but didn't fall, its shields already adapting. He rotated his phaser frequency and fired again. This time the drone collapsed. But there were more, always more. The Guardian stood silent and patient behind them, its surface rippling with patterns that might have been anticipation or might have been indifference. It had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations beyond counting. A skirmish between Starfleet and the Borg was less than a footnote in its eternal observation of time's passage. 2 minutes, the doctor shouted, and there was something approaching panic in his voice now. Data, I need you to stabilize the temporal flux at coordinates 479 Mark III. The paradox is trying to expand beyond the containment field. Data's fingers moved with inhuman speed across his tricorder, adjusting harmonic frequency to compensate. Temporal flux stabilizing. Keller was firing methodically, each shot precise despite the chaos. Captain, they're adapting to our phaser frequencies. We're running out of modulation options. Then we make do with what we have. Picard switched his phaser to maximum stun and fired at the ground between them and the advancing drones, kicking up a cloud of dust that wouldn't stop them, but would obscure their targeting sensors for crucial seconds. 1 minute. The doctor's sonic screwdriver emitted a high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate with the Guardian itself. The arch began to glow, not with light, but with something deeper, a luminescence that came from dimensions human eyes weren't meant to perceive. The Borg drones reached the edge of the temporal distortion field and stopped their movements, suddenly uncertain, as if they were receiving contradictory instructions from the collective. Their heads tilted in unison, sensors struggling to process information that refused to resolve into coherent data. It's working, Data observed. The temporal paradox is creating a localized causality loop. The Borg sensors are registering the Guardian's existence across multiple temporal states simultaneously. Their collective consciousness cannot reconcile the contradiction. The doctor collapsed to one knee, his sonic screwdriver still emitting that painful whine. 10 seconds. 9. 8. The Guardian's glow intensified, and for a moment Picard could swear he saw images flickering in the space within the arch battles. Births, deaths, moments of triumph and tragedy playing out faster than thought across the canvas of eternity. 3. 2. The doctor's hand was shaking now, the strain of maintaining the paradox, clearly taking a physical toll. 1. The sonic screwdriver's whine cut off abruptly. The Guardian's glow faded to its normal shimmer, and the temporal paradox locked into place like a door closing on normal space-time. The doctor stood slowly, breathing hard, his face pale beneath the dust and sweat. It's done. The paradox will hold for approximately 5 to 7 minutes before it collapses. During that time, the Borg will be able to approach the Guardian physically, but their sensors will give them nonsense data about its temporal function. Picard lowered his phaser, though he didn't holster it. And after the paradox collapses, then we'll need a different plan, the doctor admitted. because this was the easy part. More Borg were materializing now, and these moved with purpose despite the temporal interference. They had adapted to the contradiction, learning to ignore sensor data that made no sense and rely on visual confirmation instead. They were coming for the Guardian. And standing between them and their goal were 4 people, a handful of phasers, and a sentient time portal that would answer any question asked with perfect honesty and terrible consequences. The battle for history itself was about to begin. The Borg didn't charge. They simply walked forward with the mechanical certainty of a tide that knew the shore would eventually break. Picard fired, dropped one drone. Adjusted frequency, fired again. Another fell. But for every drone that collapsed, 2 more materialized from the cube's transporters, their movements coordinated by a consciousness that learned from every failure and adapted with terrifying speed. "We can't hold this position," Keller said, her voice steady despite the obvious impossibility of their situation. Her phaser dropped another drone, but her power cell indicator was already flashing yellow. "We don't need to hold it." The doctor had moved to stand directly in front of the Guardian, his coat billowing in the thin wind, his expression fixed with the kind of desperate calculation Picard recognized from his own worst tactical situations. "We just need to survive long enough for them to try." A new distortion shimmer appeared larger than the individual drone transports. The air solidified into a figure that made Picard's breath catch in his throat, despite years of training to suppress such reactions. The Borg Queen materialized with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for something so thoroughly integrated with machinery. Her upper body maintained an approximation of human form, pale skin stretched over cybernetic framework, but her lower half merged seamlessly with a support structure that seemed to grow from the planet's surface itself. Cables and neural interface tendrils extended from her spine, connecting her directly to the cube in orbit, making her both individual and collective simultaneously. She studied the away team with eyes that held neither malice nor mercy, only the absolute certainty of inevitability. "Captain Jean-Luc Picard," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested thousands speaking as one. "We have assimilated your tactical patterns, your command decisions, your neural pathways. You were Locutus. You will always be Locutus. Resistance is futile." Picard felt the old scars tear open memories of assimilation, of violation, of being made a weapon against everything he held sacred. But he had survived Wolf 359. He had survived the collective's invasion of his mind. He would survive this. "I was Locutus," he said quietly, his voice carrying steel beneath the calm. "I am not Locutus now, and I will not allow you to weaponize time itself." The Queen tilted her head in that characteristic gesture of the Borg processing unexpected data. "You misunderstand our purpose. We do not seek to weaponize. We seek to perfect. The temporal anomaly will allow us to refine the timeline itself, eliminating chaos and disorder from history. All contradictions resolved, all inefficiencies corrected. Perfection, Captain, for everyone." "Perfection through force," the doctor interjected, stepping forward despite the forest of weapons now tracking him from the assembled drones. "Perfection by erasing every choice, every mistake, every beautiful accident that makes existence worth living. You're not offering salvation, you're offering extinction with a pleasant aesthetic." The Queen's attention shifted to the doctor with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "You are not in our database. Your technology is unrecognized. Your physiology is—" She paused, and something that might have been confusion rippled across her features, inconsistent with temporal linearity. Explain yourself. I'm the doctor. I'm a time traveler. And I'm telling you that if you try to access the Guardian of Forever with the intention of controlling history, you won't get perfection. His voice dropped to something darker, colder. You'll get erased. Not destroyed, erased. As if you never existed in the first place. The Queen's expression didn't change, but the drones around her shifted positions slightly, a collective ripple of recalculation. You are attempting to deceive us. We do not experience fear. We cannot be threatened. I'm not threatening you, the doctor replied. I'm warning you. There's a difference. The Guardian doesn't care about your perfection, or your collective, or your assimilation protocols. It exists at the center of causality itself. And when you try to bend causality to your will, causality bends back. Data stepped forward, tricorder still active, recording everything with the dispassionate precision of his positronic brain. Queen, my analysis suggests the doctor's assessment has merit. The Guardian of Forever exhibits properties consistent with a stable temporal paradox anchor. Any attempt to manipulate it could create cascading causality violations that would propagate backward through the timeline of whoever initiated the manipulation. You offer data without certainty, the Queen said. Speculation based on incomplete analysis. We will assimilate the truth directly. She turned toward the Guardian, and the arch responded to her attention. Its surface began to glow brighter patterns, accelerating across its quasi-metallic structure. A sound emerged from within, not words exactly, but something that approximated speech shaped from harmonics that predated language itself. I am the Guardian of Forever. The voice resonated through the valley, through the ground, through the bones of everyone present. It carried the weight of eons, patient and utterly devoid of emotion. I await a question. The Queen's expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. Show us the moment of your creation. Show us the technology that formed you. We will assimilate your function and integrate it into the collective. The Guardian's glow intensified. Within the arch, images began to form swirling chaos of matter and energy. The birth of galaxies, the death of stars, civilizations rising and falling like waves on an infinite ocean. But nothing resolved into coherence. Nothing provided the technical schematic the Borg sought. Your question lacks precision, the Guardian's voice echoed. I exist across all moments. Creation is a concept insufficient to define my nature. The doctor moved closer to Picard, his voice barely a whisper. She's doing it wrong. Asking the Guardian for technical data is like asking the ocean to explain wetness. It can show her time, but it can't teach her to control it. Then we still have a chance, Picard murmured back. The Queen's expression flickered the first sign of frustration Picard had ever witnessed from the collective. Rephrase query. Display the precise temporal mechanics that enable your function. Define the process by which you facilitate chronological displacement. The Guardian's surface rippled, and new images appeared, mathematical concepts so advanced they existed more as emotions than equations. Geometric structures that folded through dimensions the human brain couldn't process. Temporal mechanics expressed as living art rather than scientific formula. Data's tricorder emitted a cascade of error messages as it tried and failed to record what the Guardian was displaying. Fascinating. The Guardian is attempting to communicate in a conceptual framework that transcends conventional mathematics. I can perceive the information, but I cannot translate it into actionable data. The Queen's frustration crystallized into action. Insufficient. We will interface directly." She extended a neural tendril toward the Guardian's surface, the cybernetic appendage moving with predatory purpose. The doctor lunged forward, but Borg drones blocked his path with movements too fast for unaugmented human reflexes to counter. "Don't!" the doctor shouted. "You can't assimilate causality. It's not technology, it's fundamental law." The Queen's tendril made contact with the Guardian's surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Guardian's voice spoke again, and this time it carried something that might have been curiosity. "You seek to integrate my function into your collective consciousness. Very well. Observe the consequence of temporal integration without comprehension." The space within the arch exploded into light. Images cascaded faster than thought. The Borg's own history played backward and forward simultaneously. Picard saw species assimilated and unassimilated in the same moment, cubes destroyed and created in temporal loops that fed into themselves. He saw the Queen's face multiplied across 1,000 contradictory timelines, each version making a different choice, each choice creating a new branch of causality that collided with the others in cascading paradox. The Queen's neural connection began to smoke. Her expression twisted into something Picard had never seen on a Borg face before: confusion, pain, fear. "We are..." She started, her voice glitching between singular and plural. "I am, we were, will be." Unable to process. Temporal data exceeds integration parameters, causality loop forming. We are becoming our own origin point. We are... She yanked the tendril back from the Guardian's surface, and the connection severed with a sound like reality tearing. The Queen staggered an utterly un-Borg-like motion that suggested the collective's perfect coordination had been disrupted at a fundamental level. The drones around her froze their movements, stuttering as if receiving contradictory commands from multiple sources simultaneously. The doctor straightened, his expression grim but vindicated. "I tried to warn you. The Guardian doesn't give you control, it gives you context. And when you're a hive mind that exists across millions of drones, in linear time, context about nonlinear causality is poison." The Queen's eyes focused on the doctor with an intensity that carried genuine hatred. Another emotion the Borg weren't supposed to feel. "You knew. You knew what would happen if we connected directly." "I suspected," the doctor corrected. "There's a difference. But yes, I knew that anything trying to assimilate the Guardian would end up trying to assimilate causality itself. And causality doesn't take kindly to being forcibly integrated into anything." Picard watched the Queen carefully, his tactical instincts screaming that they had wounded the collective but not defeated it. "Doctor, what happens now?" "Now." The doctor's expression was dark. Now the Borg collective is experiencing something they've never encountered before: temporal confusion on a massive scale. Every drone connected to the Queen just received contradictory temporal data. They're trying to reconcile multiple timelines simultaneously, and their adaptive algorithms are caught in a loop, trying to process information that contradicts itself. Data's tricorder chimed softly. "Captain, I am detecting unusual activity from the Borg cube in orbit. Its power signature is fluctuating irregularly. The vessel appears to be experiencing cascade failures across multiple systems." The Queen's voice, when she spoke again, carried static and harmonics that suggested the collective was arguing with itself. "This is unacceptable. We will adapt. We always adapt." "Not to this," the doctor said quietly. "You can't adapt to causality. You can only exist within it or outside it. And the Guardian just showed you what happens when you try to do both." The micro-paradox the doctor had created earlier chose that moment to collapse. The temporal static field dissolved, and the Guardian's true signature became clear to the Borg sensors once more. But the Queen didn't move toward it again. Her neural connection to the collective was clearly damaged. Her movements uncertain in a way that suggested internal conflict on a scale the hive mind had never experienced. "We require recalibration," she said, and for the first time, her voice sounded almost uncertain. "Temporal integration parameters must be revised. We will return. We will adapt. Will you?" The doctor stepped closer, and his voice carried neither triumph nor mercy, only the terrible certainty of someone who had seen this pattern play out across countless civilizations. "Or will you spend the next century trying to reconcile the contradictory temporal data the Guardian just flooded into your collective? How many drones are experiencing temporal confusion right now? How many are caught in causality loops, living and dying in the same moment?" The Queen's expression twisted into something horrible. Not quite pain, not quite rage, but a mixture of both, filtered through a consciousness that had forgotten how to feel individual emotion. "You have not defeated us. You have merely delayed us." "Delayed is enough," Picard said firmly. "Leave this world. Leave the Guardian. It is not yours to claim." The Queen stared at him for a long moment, and Picard saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been recognition locutus, the part of him that would always carry the echo of assimilation still visible to the collective that had made him. "We will adapt," she said again. But this time, it sounded like a promise rather than a threat. "And when we return, Captain, we will be ready for temporal anomalies." The transporter effect claimed her, and one by one, the drones around them dematerialized as well. Within moments, the valley was empty except for the away team and the Guardian of Forever, still glowing softly in the gray light. Picard's comm badge chirped. "Captain, the Borg cube is withdrawing," Riker reported, his voice carrying evident relief. "They're opening a transwarp corridor. Looks like they're leaving the sector." "Confirmed, Enterprise. Stand down from battle stations, but maintain yellow alert until they're clear." The doctor had moved to stand in front of the Guardian again, his posture carrying exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than physical weariness. "It's not over," he said quietly. "The Borg will analyze what happened here. They'll develop countermeasures, new approaches. Eventually, they'll come back." "But not today," Picard replied. "And perhaps by the time they do, we'll be better prepared as well." Keller approached the Guardian cautiously, her tricorder recording readings that would likely form the basis of a dozen DTI investigations. "Doctor, the temporal paradox you created, it collapsed cleanly. No residual causality damage, no timeline contamination. It worked exactly as you said it would." The doctor didn't turn around. "This time. But I won't pretend there wasn't risk. There's always risk when you manipulate fundamental forces." Data was circling the Guardian, his sensors still recording despite the impossibility of cataloging what they detected. "Captain, I believe we should document this encounter thoroughly. The Guardian's response to the Borg's attempt at direct interface may provide valuable defensive data should they return." "Agreed, Mr. Data. But we do so from orbit. I want the away team back on the Enterprise within 10 minutes. Picard took one last look at the Guardian of Forever, the ancient arch that had witnessed the birth and death of more civilizations than he could imagine, that had stood patient and silent while empires rose and fell around it. It had answered the Borg's question with perfect honesty and terrible consequences. It would wait here patient as stone until someone else came with questions they shouldn't ask and answers they couldn't survive. Enterprise 4 to beam up. The transporter claimed them, pulling them away from the dead world and its eternal guardian. The battle was won. But as the doctor had warned, the war was far from over. The transporter room materialized around them with a hum of reassuring normalcy. Picard stepped off the pad, feeling the artificial gravity of the Enterprise settle around him like a familiar coat after the thin atmosphere of Gateway. Behind him, Data, Keller, and the doctor followed, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed in different ways. Chief O'Brien's expression shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed relief. "Welcome back, Captain. The Borg cube cleared the sector 3 minutes ago. Commander Riker reports all stations secure." "Thank you, Chief." Picard moved toward the corridor, then paused, turning back to the doctor, who had stopped just outside the transporter alcove. "Doctor, will you join me in the observation lounge? I believe we have matters to discuss." The doctor's expression was unreadable, but he nodded. "I suppose we do." The observation lounge felt different now, quieter perhaps, or simply emptied of the desperate urgency that had driven their earlier planning. Through the viewport, Gateway hung against the stars, already receding, as the Enterprise moved to a safer distance from the temporal anomaly. Picard poured himself tea from the replicator, the ritual grounding him after the chaos of combat. He offered the doctor a cup, but the Time Lord shook his head, instead settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone conserving energy after pushing too hard for too long. Data and Keller joined them, completing the tableau of exhausted survivors, processing an impossible victory. "Captain." Data began, his voice carrying the precise neutrality that suggested he was about to deliver unwelcome analysis. "I have been reviewing the sensor logs from our encounter with the Borg. The temporal data the Guardian transmitted to the Queen was extensive. If the collective successfully processes that information, they may develop unprecedented understanding of causality manipulation." "But they won't," the doctor said quietly. "Not completely. What the Guardian showed them wasn't a blueprint. It was a warning written in a language they can't fully translate. They'll spend decades, maybe centuries, trying to reconcile the contradictory temporal frameworks they absorbed. And every time they think they've adapted, they'll discover another layer of paradox they didn't account for." Picard studied the doctor carefully, noting the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he held himself as if bracing against pain only he could feel. "You speak from experience." "I speak from watching countless civilizations try to master time and destroy themselves in the process." The doctor's gaze drifted to the viewport, to the planet below, where the Guardian waited in eternal patience. "The Borg are no different. They're just better organized about their self-destruction." Keller leaned forward, her professional composure reasserting itself despite the day's chaos. "Doctor, I need to understand what happened when the Queen interfaced with the Guardian. The temporal readings I recorded suggest she experienced multiple timeline branches simultaneously. Is that accurate? More or less?" The doctor straightened slightly, his tone shifting into something resembling a lecture. "The Guardian exists at the intersection of every possible timeline. When the Queen tried to assimilate its function, she connected herself, and by extension, the entire collective, to that intersection. For a moment, every Borg drone in existence experienced causality from the Guardian's perspective. Past, present, and future all happening at once." Data tilted his head in that characteristic gesture of processing. Such an experience would be catastrophic to a consciousness dependent on linear temporal progression. The collective's hive mind requires sequential processing to function. Simultaneous temporal awareness would create infinite recursive loops. Exactly. The doctor's expression carried grim satisfaction. The Borg's greatest strength, their shared consciousness, became their greatest weakness. One mind experiencing temporal paradox is manageable. Billions of minds experiencing it simultaneously, all trying to reconcile contradictory data through their neural network. That's not just confusion. That's existential crisis on an unprecedented scale. Picard set down his tea, his tactical mind already moving through implications. Will they recover? Eventually. The doctor's certainty carried the weight of someone who had seen this pattern repeat across galaxies. They'll quarantine the affected drones, purge the corrupted data, rebuild their consensus reality. But it will take time, and they'll be significantly more cautious about attempting temporal manipulation in the future. How much time? Keller asked, her tone carrying professional urgency. The DTI needs to assess the ongoing threat level. The doctor shrugged, a gesture of elegant uncertainty. Years at minimum, possibly decades, depending on how deep the temporal confusion propagated through their network. The Borg adapt quickly to conventional threats, but this wasn't conventional. You can't adapt a paradox, you can only learn not to touch it. Silence settled over the observation lounge, broken only by the ambient hum of the Enterprise's systems and the soft pulse of warp drive holding them in position. Picard broke it with the question that had been forming since they materialized back aboard. Doctor, the Guardian addressed you during the confrontation. It recognized you as someone who understands temporal mechanics in ways even Data's positronic brain struggles with. You're not simply a traveler in time. You're something more. The doctor's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog defensiveness, resignation. Something that might have been sorrow. I'm a Time Lord. My people were the self-appointed guardians of causality itself, maintaining the proper flow of time across the universe. We watched. We observed. We intervened only when absolutely necessary to prevent catastrophic timeline collapse. Data caught the past tense immediately. They're gone. The doctor's voice flattened into something carefully neutral, the tone of someone discussing a wound too old to bleed, but never healed. There was a war. Time itself became a weapon. And when the dust settled, I was one of the few survivors. Now I do what my people once did, but without the authority or the backup. Just me, my ship, and a very long list of places I'm not supposed to interfere, but do anyway. Picard understood loss, the loss of crew of ships, of the person he had been before the Borg took him. But the scale the doctor described was beyond comprehension. An entire civilization of time travelers gone. And this man carrying their burden alone. I'm sorry, Picard said simply. The doctor met his gaze, and something in those ancient eyes softened slightly. So am I. But self-pity doesn't prevent catastrophes. Action does. Which is why I violated about 17 of your regulations to land on your bridge uninvited. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I assume there will be paperwork about that. Extensive paperwork, Keller confirmed, though her tone carried less hostility than earlier. The DTI will require detailed testimony from everyone involved. There will be inquiries, reviews, possibly formal hearings before the Federation Council. Will Captain Picard face disciplinary action? The doctor asked, his tone sharpening with protective concern that surprised everyone, possibly including himself. Keller hesitated, then shook her head slowly. Honestly, I don't know. The Temporal Prime Directive exists to prevent timeline contamination. But the contamination we prevented today would have been total. My report will reflect that Captain Picard's decisions, while unorthodox, were made in the face of an existential threat that conventional protocols were insufficient to address. That's about as close to approval as the DTI gets. the doctor observed dryly. It's also honest, Keller replied, which is what my job requires. Whether the review board agrees with my assessment remains to be seen. Picard accepted this with the equanimity of a captain who had faced courts-martial before. I stand by my decisions. If Starfleet wishes to censure me for preventing the Borg from weaponizing causality itself, they're welcome to explain how following protocol would have led to a better outcome. Data, who had been quietly processing data throughout the conversation, spoke up with characteristic precision. Captain, I should note that the sensor logs from our encounter provide unprecedented documentation of temporal mechanics in practice. The scientific value of this data is significant. Starfleet Science Division may well view this incident as a research opportunity rather than a violation. Leave it to Starfleet to find the silver lining in nearly losing all of history, the doctor muttered, but there was fondness beneath the sarcasm. Picard stood moving to the viewport where Gateway's curve was now barely visible against the stellar backdrop. Doctor, what happens to the Guardian now? Will the Borg's attempted interface have damaged it in any way? The Guardian. The doctor joined him at the viewport, hands in his coat pockets, his reflection visible in the transparent aluminum. The Guardian is fine. It survived worse than a confused hive mind trying to assimilate it. Probably barely registered the attempt as anything more significant than a child asking a complicated question. It seemed almost sad, Picard said quietly, surprising himself with the observation. When it spoke, when it showed the Borg what they couldn't comprehend. There was no judgment in its voice, but there was something. Regret, perhaps. The doctor nodded slowly. The Guardian has watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than galaxies have existed. It's seen every mistake that can be made, every triumph, every tragedy, and it can't intervene. It can only answer questions and show what is, was, or will be. That kind of eternal witness without agency. He paused, his expression distant. I can't imagine anything lonelier. Yet it endures, Data observed. Eternal observation without the capacity for intervention would be, from a human perspective, a form of torment. Yet the Guardian persists in its function. Because someone has to, the doctor said simply. Someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the record, even if that record is written in time itself, rather than in databanks or history books. The Guardian is that someone. Has been for eons. Will be for eons more. Keller cleared her throat, drawing their attention back to the more immediate concerns. Captain, I need to return to Federation headquarters to file my initial report. With your permission, I'd like to depart on the next available transport. Granted, Agent Keller. And... Picard paused, choosing his words carefully. Thank you. For your courage down on Gateway. For making the difficult choice when protocol and necessity conflicted. Keller's expression softened slightly. I joined the DTI because I believe the timeline is worth protecting, Captain. Today, protecting it meant bending the rules we created to defend it. I can live with that contradiction. She stood nodded to Data and the doctor and departed with the brisk efficiency of someone already composing reports in her head. The observation lounge felt larger with just the three of them. I should be going as well, the doctor said after a moment. The TARDIS is still parked rather illegally on your bridge, and I imagine your crew would like their workspace back. Before you go, Picard said, turning to face the doctor fully. I have one more question. You said you intervene when necessary despite having no authority to do so. How do you decide? How do you know when the risk of action outweighs the risk of observation? The doctor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if looking at something or someone far beyond the Enterprise's hull. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of choices that had defined him across lifetimes. "I don't always know," he admitted. "Sometimes, I guess. Sometimes I get it wrong, and people die because I was too slow or too fast or too certain I knew best. But I learned a long time ago that perfect knowledge is impossible, and perfect safety is an illusion. So I do what I can with what I have in the time I'm given. And I try very, very hard not to become the kind of person who stands by and watches preventable catastrophes because the rules say intervention isn't permitted." He met Picard's eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding the shared burden of command when command means choosing between terrible options. "You understand that already," the doctor continued. "You proved it today when you chose to trust a stranger who appeared in a box over the protocols that were supposed to keep you safe. That kind of judgment, knowing when to follow rules and when to break them, isn't something anyone can teach. You either have it or you don't." "And if I'd chosen differently?" Picard asked. "If I had followed the temporal prime directive exactly as written, then we'd all be speaking Borg right now," the doctor said bluntly. "Or we wouldn't be speaking at all because the timeline we existed in would have been overwritten by one where the collective controlled causality itself. You made the right call, Captain. Live with it, learn from it, and don't second-guess yourself when the next impossible choice arrives." Data, who had been observing the exchange with characteristic attention, spoke up. "Doctor, may I ask a personal question?" "You can ask. I might even answer. Do you ever regret the interventions you make? The rules you break in service of what you perceive as necessary?" The doctor's smile was sad and ancient. "Every single one, Commander. Every intervention carries a cost, even when it's the right choice. The universe doesn't reward virtue with clean consciences. It just keeps moving forward. And you do your best to make sure that forward motion doesn't crush everyone in its path." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at Picard. "Captain, when Starfleet holds their hearings, when the DTI asks you to justify your actions, remember this. You didn't just save this timeline today. You saved the Borg from themselves. That cube is withdrawing to lick wounds most hive minds don't even know how to process. You gave them something they've never experienced failure without adaptation as a solution. That's a gift, even if they don't recognize it." "A gift?" Picard's eyebrow rose skeptically. "Failure is how you learn limitations," the doctor explained. "The Borg have never truly failed before. They've only encountered temporary setbacks before adaptation. Today they learned there are forces in the universe. They cannot assimilate problems they cannot solve by adding more drones to the equation. That's the first step toward becoming something more than a plague of mechanical locusts." "You believe the Borg can change?" Data asked, intrigued. "I believe anything can change, given enough time and the right catalyst." The doctor's expression was unreadable. "Though I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for the collective to develop a conscience. Some lessons take longer than civilizations last." Picard extended his hand, and the doctor shook it with the firm grip of someone who understood the weight of shared experience. "If you're ever in this sector again, Doctor, and you need assistance, I'll violate your airspace uninvited and land on your bridge without permission." The doctor finished grinning. "Just like today, because asking permission takes too long when reality is unraveling." "Fair enough." The doctor departed, his coat trailing behind him, leaving Picard and Data alone in the observation lounge. "Sir," Data said after a moment, "the doctor is one of the most unusual individuals I have ever encountered. His knowledge of temporal mechanics is profound, His technology inexplicable, and his approach to crisis management is... He paused, searching for the appropriate descriptor. Aggressively unorthodox. All true. Picard agreed. And yet, Commander, I find myself grateful he was here. Without his intervention, today's outcome would have been catastrophically different. Agreed, Captain. Data tilted his head thoughtfully. It is curious that the universe contains beings, such as the Doctor, individuals who exist outside conventional authority structures, yet serve as guardians of stability when formal institutions prove insufficient. Picard returned to the viewport, watching Gateway disappear into the distance as the Enterprise prepared to depart the sector. Perhaps that's exactly what the universe needs, Mr. Data. Officials who enforce the rules and mavericks who know when to break them. The balance between order and necessary chaos. A paradox, Data observed. The best truths usually are. On the bridge, the TARDIS dematerialized with its characteristic grinding wheeze, folding itself out of normal space-time and leaving behind only a faint ionization trace that dissipated within seconds. In the captain's chair, Riker watched it disappear and shook his head with a combination of relief and residual disbelief. "Helm," he said, settling back into his seat. "Set course for Starbase 234, Warp 6. "Aye, sir." The Enterprise turned away from Gateway, leaving behind the Guardian of Forever to its eternal vigil. Below, on the dead world's surface, the ancient arch stood unchanged. It had witnessed an attempted conquest by one of the galaxy's most formidable threats. It had shown that threat the consequences of its ambition, and now it returned to its patient, waiting neither triumphant nor concerned. It was the Guardian of Forever. It had all the time in the universe. And somewhere, anywhere, anywhen, a blue box materialized in a new crisis, carrying a madman with a box and an impossible promise that he would help whether invited or not, because someone had to. The universe kept spinning. Time kept flowing. And those who guarded both officially and otherwise continued their eternal work. In the end, the Doctor did not leave Star Trek's universe with monuments, treaties, or a rewritten history. What he left behind was subtler and far more disruptive. Starfleet survived the crisis with its principles technically intact, yet no longer untouched. The Prime Directive remained on the books, but it no longer felt absolute. It now carried weight, hesitation, and memory. For Picard and those who stood beside him, the encounter forced an uncomfortable realization. Rules are tools, not truths. They exist to protect life, but they cannot replace moral judgment when history itself becomes a weapon. The Borg were not defeated by superior firepower or technological escalation, but by being denied certainty by a universe that refused to be simplified and owned. The Doctor departed as he always does, without claiming credit or authority. But the Federation he left behind was quieter, more cautious, and more self-aware. In a civilization built on ideals, he introduced doubt not to weaken them, but to ensure they were chosen, not obeyed. And that doubt once planted would outlast him. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.